Sir, can you tell Santa we moved? The boy's voice landed softly in the cold, as if it didn't want to break what little quiet the night still had. Snow was falling in thin, patient sheets, turning the sidewalks into a pale hush. Christmas lights blinked from storefronts and apartment windows, steady, cheerful, almost stubborn, but the warmth they promised felt like it belonged to someone else. Nora Hayes, 29, tightened her grip on her son's hand as they stepped onto the icy curb. Eli was 4. Small boots, big eyes, cheeks already pink from the wind. Nora's jacket was too thin for December, the zipper that never quite held. A knitted beanie tried to keep her hair in place, but damp strands kept escaping, clinging to her cheeks where melted snow and tiredness met. Over her shoulder hung a worn backpack. Eli's clothes, a few toiletries, the last pieces of a life packed into something that didn't even look full. Behind them, the apartment door clicked shut with a final flat sound, the kind of sound that didn't argue, didn't explain, didn't apologize. Evicted. The landlord had waited until the sun went down, until carols drifted through the hall from a neighbor's speaker, until the building itself felt distracted enough to pretend it didn't notice a mother and child being peeled out of their own home. 2 months behind on rent, no more warnings, no more extensions. Nora hadn't begged. She didn't have any begging left in her body. For a year, she'd worked double shifts at Harbor Spoon Cafe, smiling through aching feet, swallowing down worry with lukewarm coffee, trying to stretch minimum wage over inhalers, prescriptions, and hospital bills that arrived like threats in white envelopes. Debt collectors called so often that her phone ringing started to feel like an alarm she couldn't shut off. And now, on one of the coldest nights of the year, time had finally outrun her. Eli shuffled beside her, dragging a plastic bag behind him. His stuffed bear poked out the top, one button eye staring at the snow like it, too, was confused. They passed glowing window displays, gold ornaments, oversized candy canes, fake snow that didn't melt. Families moved around them in thick coats and easy laughter. Nora turned her face away the way people do when they don't want to be seen needing something. "Mommy," Eli said, quiet and unsure. "Are we moving?" Nora squeezed his hand. "Just taking a walk, honey." "But why did we pack all our stuff?" She paused under a street lamp as a car slid past, spraying slush up the curb. Nora looked down at him, his eyelashes damp, his mouth trying to be brave, his eyes already learning too much. Her chest tightened like a fist. Eli stopped walking. He stared at her with the seriousness only small children can carry. "If we move tonight, will Santa still find us?" Something in Nora cracked, not loudly, not dramatically. Just a thin line of hurt opening inside her, the way ice gives under a careful step. She knelt, ignoring the wet that seeped through her jeans, and held his cheeks in her hands. "He always finds kind hearts," she whispered, as if saying it softly might make it true. "Right?" Eli thought, then nodded with the kind of faith adults forget how to hold. "I hope he gives you a bag of happiness." Nora let out a laugh that sounded like it had to travel a long way to reach her mouth. A tear slid down her face. She wiped it before Eli could notice. "Me too," she breathed. They kept walking because stopping meant admitting they had nowhere to go. Across town, Julian Ashford stepped out of the Grand Regent Theater, the company gala's glitter still clinging to his coat like perfume. He'd left early, tie loosened, collar up, a paper bag of untouched appetizers swinging from his hand. He was successful in the way magazines loved. He owned the restaurant group that included Harbor Spoon. People said his name like it meant something solid. But tonight he felt hollow, like all the praise and champagne had filled rooms. Not him. He turned onto a quieter block where the city's shine thinned out, and that's when he saw them. A woman and a child beneath a flickering lamp, bags piled at their feet, thin coats, snow on their shoulders. A boy dragging a bag with a bear inside. Julian slowed. "Nora?" She turned, and the surprise on her face shifted quickly into embarrassment, like she'd been caught doing something shameful, existing while exhausted. "Mr. Ashford," she said tightly, polite, controlled. Julian glanced at the bags, at the child. "Where are you headed tonight?" Nora's eyes darted away. "Just trying to figure things out." The boy looked up at Julian, hopeful as a candle flame, and in the middle of Christmas night, he asked again, clear and trusting, "Sir, can you tell Santa we moved?" For a moment, the world did that strange thing it sometimes does in deep winter, quieting so completely you can hear your own thoughts. Julian blinked as if he'd misheard. Nora's shoulders drew in, bracing for pity, for judgment, for the small humiliations that often followed being seen. But Eli's face held only earnestness. Tomishness. No shame, no strategy, just a child's belief that grown-ups could pass messages to miracles. Julian crouched slightly to meet him at eye level. The snow gathered on his lashes, melting there like tiny questions. I think, he said gently, Santa would want to know exactly where to find you, especially if your mom has been extra brave this year. Eli's smile arrived instantly, bright, uncomplicated. Nora swallowed hard, her throat working around words she didn't want to need. Julian stood and, after a beat, nodded toward the corner cafe still lit on the next block. Come on, let me at least get you both something warm. Nora's first instinct was to refuse. Refusing had become a kind of armor, thin, dented, but familiar. Then Eli tugged her sleeve. I want hot cocoa, Mommy. Something about his simple request, so ordinary, so childlike, broke through Nora's defenses. She gave a small, reluctant nod. Inside the cafe, warmth wrapped around them like a blanket they hadn't earned but desperately needed. The windows fogged with condensation, making the outside world feel far away. Eli sat on the booth seat and sipped cocoa topped with whipped cream, leaving a white mustache on his upper lip. He giggled and wiped it with the back of his hand as if it was the funniest thing in the universe. Nora cradled her mug between cold palms. She stared into the steam like it might tell her what to do next. Julian didn't press. He didn't interrogate. He simply sat across from her, quiet in a way that felt respectful rather than distant. Eventually, the truth spilled out, not in a dramatic confession, but in small, exhausted sentences. The eviction, the overdue rent, Eli's asthma attacks, the bills that kept multiplying, the nights she'd skip dinner so he could have one more bowl of soup, the way she'd learned to smile at customers while her insides felt like they were unraveling. Julian listened with the focus of someone who had, for once, stopped trying to manage life and started trying to understand it. I didn't mean for you to see me like that, Nora admitted, her gaze drifting to Eli, tracing circles in the fog on the window. I just didn't know where else to go. Julian's voice lowered. You've been carrying the weight of 2 lives. Most people wouldn't last a week the way you have. He paused, careful. And you still showed up, still worked, still helped others. Nora stared into her cocoa. Compliments used to make her uncomfortable. Tonight, they made her feel exposed, like someone had peeled back the layers she'd worked hard to keep intact. Julian reached across the table slowly, not assuming. His hand touched hers, cold, tense, smaller than it should have felt for someone who held everything together. You don't have to go through this alone tonight, he said. Nora looked up. Their eyes met, and something shifted. Not charity, not obligation, something quieter. Something like being seen without being reduced. When Eli's eyelids started fluttering and his head dipped toward Nora's shoulder, Julian stood. There's a place nearby, he said, warm, safe, just for tonight. Nora's spine stiffened. I can't accept that. Eli, half asleep, mumbled into her sleeve. Can we stay? Just one night? Just until Santa finds us? The words landed like a small, gentle surrender. Nora's shoulders sagged. She nodded once, barely. They walked a few blocks through snow that squeaked underfoot. Nora carried Eli now, his arms looped around her neck. The motel was modest, tucked behind a laundromat, but it was clean, and the lobby smelled faintly of pine and cinnamon, like someone had tried in their own small way to make the world kinder. Julian spoke quietly to the front desk, sliding a card across. They don't need to know who paid, he said. Just make sure the room is warm. Upstairs, the room held 2 twin beds and a small heater humming in the corner. Nora laid Eli down carefully, tugging his boots off, pulling the blanket up to his chin. He didn't wake. When she turned, Julian was already in the doorway. Sleep well, Nora, he said. She didn't know how to answer. He didn't wait for gratitude. The door closed softly behind him. Later, long after the room had gone quiet, Nora sat by the window with her hands around a paper cup of warm tap water. Snow fell outside in steady silence. She looked at Eli's sleeping face, then back at the snowfall. Maybe, just maybe, good people still existed. In the morning, light slipped through the curtains. Nora noticed a paper bag hanging from the doorknob. Inside, a piece of toast wrapped neatly, a small carton of milk, and a folded note. For brave mornings in kinder winters. Nora pressed the note to her lips, breathing in slowly like she was learning for the first time in a long time what it felt like to be held by something gentle. Monday morning arrived with the kind of calm that felt unreal, like waking up in someone else's life. Nora moved slowly through the motel room, not wanting to startle the fragile peace. Eli was still asleep, curled on his side, his stuffed bear pinned under his arm like a promise. The heater clicked softly in the corner. Outside, the snow had thinned to a gentle drift, and the street looked cleaner, almost innocent. She should have felt grateful. She did. But gratitude, when you've been drowning for too long, can come with a sting. It can feel like a reminder of how close you were to losing everything. After a quick wash in the tiny bathroom sink, Nora buttoned Eli into his sweater and coaxed him into his boots. He blinked awake, looked around, and smiled as if the room itself was a gift. "Mommy," he said, hushed and reverent, "Santa can find us here, right?" Nora knelt to straighten his beanie. "He can find you anywhere," she whispered. "But yes, here too." She walked him to the public preschool program that had finally accepted him through a community scholarship, something she'd applied for months ago and almost forgotten while she fought bigger fires. The building smelled like crayons and disinfectant, and children's voices echoed down the hall like tiny bells. Eli clung for a moment, then ran toward a table with puzzles, waving once over his shoulder. Nora stood in the doorway longer than she needed to, watching him exist in a world that didn't know the shape of their fear. Then she went to work. Harbor Spoon Cafe was already buzzing, coffee machines hissing, plates clattering, the warm, greasy comfort of breakfast. Nora tied her apron, tucked her hair back, and tried to step into her normal self. And then she saw Julian. He wasn't in a suit. No crisp collar, no polished boardroom face, just a dark sweater with the sleeves rolled up, a mug of coffee in his hands, sitting at the far end of the counter as if he belonged to the everyday world. Nora's heartbeat stumbled. She could have avoided him, kept moving, kept busy, but something steadier rose up in her chest. Not pride exactly, more like the decision to meet what happened last night with her whole face, not half of it. She walked over, palms damp beneath her apron. "About last night," she began. Her voice stayed calm through effort. "Thank you. I'm not good at accepting help, but we really needed it." Julian looked up, and the softness in his expression surprised her. "It wasn't help," he said quietly after a sip. "It was humanity." The words settled into her like warmth that didn't burn. Nora swallowed, her eyes stinging in a way she refused to apologize for. That week moved forward in small steps. Eli laughed more. Nora slept deeper. She returned to the motel each evening, feeling less like a trespasser and more like a person allowed to exist. Then the following Monday, she came home to find an envelope slid beneath the motel door. Her stomach tightened so fast it almost hurt. Bad news had trained her body like a reflex. She opened it with careful fingers. Inside was a key, an apartment key, taped beside a note in familiar handwriting. "Just a safe place for the night. We can figure out the rest together. Jay." There was an address 2 blocks from the cafe. Nora sat down hard on the edge of the bed. For a few seconds, she simply stared, waiting for the trick, the hidden cost, the moment where kindness turned into debt. Her first instinct was refusal. She'd spent years building herself around one belief: if you accept too much, you'll owe too much. And owing was how people got trapped. But then Eli patted out of the bathroom, rubbing his eyes. "Is that the new house, Mommy?" he asked, voice full of wonder, like the idea of home was something he could still say without it hurting. Nora stared at her son, and the decision shifted, not because she suddenly felt brave, but because she couldn't keep making him carry uncertainty like a backpack. That afternoon, she went to the address. The building was old, but cared for. The hallway smelled faintly of laundry detergent and warm bread. When she opened the unit, it wasn't grand, just a compact space with wood floors, soft yellow walls, and 2 windows letting in pale winter sunlight. A small kitchen table, a heater that worked, a secondhand sofa that looked scrubbed clean with attention, not neglect. Nora stood in the middle of the room, breath caught in her throat, as if she'd stepped into the outline of a life she'd stopped imagining. Her phone buzzed. A message from Julian. "Rent's covered for 3 months. After that, it'll come out of your check. No charity, just time." Nora sank onto the sofa slowly. Her fingers trembled around the phone. "Okay," she whispered to no one, to the quiet walls, to the idea that maybe stability could be borrowed long enough to rebuild. That night, Eli ran into the bedroom and squealed at the sight of two neatly made single beds with real blankets. He flopped onto one and announced, "Santa will definitely find us now." Nora stood in the doorway with her hand over her mouth, laughing and crying in the same silent breath. Later, after Eli fell asleep with his bear tucked under his chin, Nora sat by the window and watched the streetlights glow. For the first time in what felt like forever, her lungs filled easily. Not from certainty, from relief. And relief, she realized, could be its own kind of beginning. 2 weeks later, Nora's paycheck arrived. She was halfway through her break, sitting at the back table with a cup of lukewarm tea, when she noticed the number at the bottom, higher than usual, enough to make her blink and check twice like her eyes were playing a cruel joke. She scanned the fine print. A new line had been added. Adjustment, Single Parent Support Initiative. Her throat tightened. It wasn't just money. It was proof that someone, somewhere had decided her life was worth being made a little lighter. Nora folded the pay stub carefully, as if rough hands might tear it. Later that day, she found Julian near the counter wiping down a section that didn't need wiping, his quiet way of being present without hovering. Nora walked up, holding the paper like evidence. "You did something to my pay." Julian didn't look up right away. "I didn't touch it," he said, then finally glanced at her with a half smile that wasn't smug, just sure. "Let's just say people like you deserve a little more wind at their back." Nora's eyes stung again, and this time she didn't fight it so hard. "I don't want special treatment," she murmured, voice low. "You're not getting special treatment," Julian replied. "You're getting what should have been normal all along." He didn't bring it up again after that. He didn't make it a story. He didn't hang it over her head like a ribbon she had to keep bowing to. And that, more than the extra dollars, changed something in Nora, because dignity isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It's a quiet space where a person can stand without flinching. Eli, however, had no understanding of subtlety. Every time Julian walked into the cafe, Eli would brighten like the lights on the window display and shout, "It's Santa's helper." Customers laughed. Julian would tip an imaginary hat and whisper, "Shh, secret agent rules." Eli nodded solemnly and sealed it with a pinky swear, as if this was the most sacred contract in the world. Nora would shake her head and hide her smile behind a stack of plates. Weeks passed. Winter softened around the edges. Nora began to feel the slow return of something she'd thought she'd lost for good, a small, stubborn hope. Then one rainy afternoon, the bell above the cafe door jingled, and Julian walked in soaked through. His coat clung darkly to his shoulders. His hair dripped. His face looked paler than usual, and when he spoke, his voice sounded rough, like sandpaper softened by exhaustion. "Forgot my umbrella," he muttered with a tired smile. Nora took one look at him and felt a different kind of alarm. Not fear, concern. She noticed the redness at the tip of his nose, the way he cleared his throat twice as if trying to pretend it meant nothing. "Sit," she said, firmer than she expected. Julian raised an eyebrow. "Eyebrow?" Half amused, half surprised, but he obeyed, sliding into a corner booth. Nora disappeared into the kitchen without another word. 15 minutes later, she returned with a tray, steaming ginger porridge, a slice of toast, and a mug of hot lemon water with honey. Julian stared at it like it was a foreign language. Nora set it down and crossed her arms. "You look like you're 2 sneezes away from collapsing. Eat." He picked up the spoon, took a bite, then another. A slow exhale left him, as if his body had been holding its breath for days. "This," he said hoarsely, "tastes like something I forgot I needed." Nora gave him a small, satisfied nod and walked away before he could turn it into gratitude. Later, after the rush died down and the cafe grew quieter, Julian was still there. Someone Almost certainly Eli had dragged a small blanket from the back room and draped it over his shoulders. Nora brought on him fresh tea and sat across from him, the two of them wrapped in the calm that comes after surviving a hard day. "Where did you learn to cook like that?" Julian asked. Nora shrugged. "Life teaches you things when it has to." He waited, gentle in his silence. "I used to want to be a musician," she added, surprising herself with the confession. "I even went to school for it. But then Eli came early, and everything changed." Julian nodded slowly. "I get that," he said. "My parents died when I was young. I was raised by my aunt. You never really forget what it feels like to be alone." There was a pause, not uncomfortable, just honest. "It's strange," Julian continued quietly, "how people think being in charge means you don't get tired." Nora's smile was faint but real. "It's stranger how people assume being strong means you don't need anyone." Julian looked at her then, not as an owner looking at an employee, not as a rescuer looking at someone rescued, as a man looking at someone who had fed him warmth without asking for anything back. And Nora realized something that unsettled her in the best way. She wasn't just receiving kindness anymore. She was returning it. And maybe that was how healing started. Quietly, evenly, like two people learning to share the weight without naming it. After that rainy afternoon, Julian started showing up more often. Sometimes he had a reason. Inventory checks, a quick meeting with the manager, a new supplier issue. Other times he had nothing but a quiet presence, slipping into a seat at the counter after hours with a cup of black coffee, as if the cafe was the only place that let his shoulders drop. Nora noticed the pattern, but she didn't name it. Naming things made them heavier, so she let it be what it was, a rhythm, a soft, surprising rhythm that made the weeks feel less sharp. Eli, of course, treated Julian like a holiday miracle with a human face. He'd wave frantically whenever Julian entered, sometimes running to him with a drawing or a napkin scribble, stick figures holding hands under a lopsided star. "Santa's helper," Eli would whisper dramatically, even though he never actually whispered. Julian played along with an ease that startled Nora. He'd crouch down, accept the drawing like it was a business contract, and say, "Classified, top secret, only for agents." Eli would nod, solemn as a judge. Nora pretended to be annoyed, but the truth was simpler. Watching Julian with her son made something in her chest unclench. Not because she needed a savior, not because she was trying to build a fantasy. Because kindness that shows up consistently, without making a show of itself, begins to feel like something you can trust. One night, after the last customers drifted out and the floors were mopped, Nora went to check on Eli in the storage room where he napped on a small cot. She found the door cracked open. Julian was inside. Eli had fallen asleep sitting upright, his head tipped forward like a flower too heavy for its stem. Julian lifted him carefully, like he'd done it 100 times, and carried him to the cot. He pulled the blanket up, then tucked Eli's stuffed bear under his arm with the kind of tenderness that made Nora's throat tighten. Julian turned and saw Nora in the doorway. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to, because sometimes the most important things are too delicate to be explained without bruising them. A few days later, the cafe got slammed with a catering rush. Holiday parties, office luncheons, last-minute orders. Nora was moving fast, trying to keep everything lined up in her head like numbers on a receipt. That's when she made the mistake. She misread a catering slip and sent out the wrong menu for a big holiday event. The client called furious. It was the kind of mistake that could cost them money, reputation, could cost her the job, especially considering everything Julian had already done for her. Nora stood frozen near the prep line, the phone's angry voice still echoing in her ear. Her vision tunneled, her chest filled with that old familiar panic. Here it comes. Here's the moment you lose what you finally got back. Before she could speak, Julian walked in, took the phone from the counter, and answered calmly. His voice was steady, clear, almost gentle. He apologized. His mistake, he said. He offered a full discount and free dessert vouchers for the entire party. He didn't flinch when the client snapped. He didn't defend himself. He simply took the hit, absorbed it, and ended the call with a quiet promise to make it right. When he hung up, Nora rushed toward him, words spilling out raw. "Why did you do that? It was my mistake." Julian shrugged like it was obvious. "We're a team." "But it's not about being perfect," he said softer now. "It's about giving enough of a damn to fix what's broken." Nora looked around. Several employees had been listening from behind the prep line. Their faces held surprise, even something like awe. They had never seen Julian like this, not a distant owner, not a polished executive, but a man who stood between a mistake and a punishment and chose protection. Nora didn't say thank you. She couldn't. Not yet. The gratitude was too tangled with fear. But later, when she walked past him at the counter, she placed a small folded napkin down beside his coffee. Inside was a note in her tidy handwriting. "For what you forgot you needed." Julian unfolded it slowly, then looked up as Nora turned away. And for a second, his expression wasn't business. It was something quieter, something like being found. Snow returned the week before Christmas, but this time it felt different. Not like a threat, more like a blanket, soft, inevitable, almost gentle. Harbor Spoon glowed in the early evening, twinkle lights wrapped around the windows casting warm gold onto the sidewalk. Inside, the cafe smelled like cinnamon and fresh bread. Laughter drifted from the kitchen. The old jukebox played carols low enough that it felt like background comfort rather than a demand to be cheerful. Nora was drying glasses when Julian walked in quietly, his hands tucked into his coat pockets. He didn't go to the counter right away. He walked straight toward Eli, who was sitting in a corner booth drawing on a napkin with a stubby crayon. Julian placed a small wooden box on the table. "For you," he said. Eli's eyes widened. "Is it from Santa?" Julian crouched down, smiling. "Sort of. He asked me to deliver it early." Eli opened the box carefully, as if it might break from excitement. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a small card and a golden pencil etched with tiny music notes. The card read, "Santa found you. He told me you've been very brave. This pencil is for your first song for Mommy." Eli blinked, then stared up at Julian like he was witnessing real magic. "Really?" Julian nodded. He said your heart was too kind to miss. Nora watched from behind the counter, her throat tightening hard. The pencil wasn't just a gift. It was a message. "I see you. I see who you were before arch survival swallowed everything." Later, when the cafe thinned out and Eli fell asleep in the back, Nora approached Julian near the end of the counter. She placed her hand gently on the wooden box. "Why do you do so much for us?" she asked, voice barely above the hum of the espresso machine. Julian looked up slowly. His expression was calm, but there was something steady underneath it. Like he'd already decided the truth mattered. "Because you reminded me what real strength looks like," he said. He hesitated just long enough that Nora felt the weight of what he was choosing to reveal. "And because you made me want to be someone a little boy could believe in." For a moment, Nora couldn't speak. The words didn't feel like a compliment. They felt like a bridge, one built quietly, plank by plank, without asking permission. That same week, Nora began doing something unexpected. Every evening after the main dinner rush, she would bring out a large pot and start cooking simple dishes, hearty soups, stews, whatever the pantry allowed. She didn't do it because anyone asked. She did it because it felt like the first time in a long time she had something to give that wasn't forced out of her by fear. She started calling it second dinner. It was for staff, tired servers with sore backs, dishwashers with cracked hands. And it was for anyone who lingered too long with too little. The quiet man who always ordered water, the older woman who sat by the window counting coins, the stranger whose coat looked more like a blanket than clothing. Her pot of soup became a small center of gravity. People stayed after their shifts. They talked. They laughed softly over bowls of lentil stew or leftover pasta. The cafe felt less like a workplace and more like a shelter that didn't ask questions. Even Julian lingered longer than he used to, content to sit nearby with his coffee, while the room warmed with ordinary human closeness. One night, after finishing her sweet potato stew, Julian leaned back with a quiet chuckle. "We're all just chasing your soup now." Nora laughed, brushing hair from her cheek, her face flushed. Not with embarrassment, but with something almost like belonging. A few nights before Christmas, the door chimed and a man stepped in. Middle-aged, unshaven, wrapped in layers that looked scavenged rather than chosen. He hovered near the entrance like he expected to be told to leave. Nora noticed him instantly. She said nothing. She packed 2 slices of day-old banana bread, poured a fresh cup of coffee, and walked over. "On the house," she said gently, setting it down. "It's cold out." The man stared, speechless, then nodded, whispering, "Thank you," as if the words didn't feel safe in his mouth. Julian had watched the whole thing. A moment later, he came to Nora's side, stirring his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You didn't stop being the girl who helps others," he said. "You just forgot she was a hero." Nora turned toward him, startled. Julian didn't smile this time. His eyes held something deeper than admiration, something like reverence. Outside, snow kept falling. Inside, Christmas arrived in a quieter form. Not glitter and expensive gifts, but warmth that settled around your ribs when someone saw the best in you and believed it was still there. The whispers started like they usually do. Small, careless, disguised as harmless curiosity. Nora first heard them from behind the sink, hands deep in suds, scrubbing a pan harder than it deserved. The kitchen was warm, loud with the usual clatter, but the words slipped through anyway, thin as smoke. "She only gets the good shifts because she's the boss's favorite. Single mom with a sad story. No wonder she gets away with everything. Must be nice to have the owner wrapped around your finger." Nora's shoulders stiffened. Her fingers tightened around the sponge until it hurt. She didn't turn around, She didn't demand names. She just kept scrubbing as if she could erase the sound by making herself useful enough. But the truth was, the words didn't cut because they were new. They cut because a part of her, small, tired, too honest, believed them. That night, after she tucked Eli into bed in their little apartment, Nora sat at the kitchen table and stared out at the skyline. The city lights looked the same as they always did, indifferent and pretty. The heater hummed. Eli's breathing was soft behind the bedroom door. Everything was safe. And yet, something in her chest felt unsteady, like her sense of self had developed a crack she couldn't ignore. Have I become dependent? She thought. Did I trade one kind of survival for another? She remembered the night she'd been evicted, how she'd held Eli's hand and kept moving because stopping meant collapsing. She remembered the way pride had been the only thing she owned outright, the only thing no one could take. Now, pride felt like a complicated thing. It didn't just protect you. Sometimes it imprisoned you. Nora pulled a sheet of paper from the drawer and began to write a letter, a request for temporary leave. No drama, no accusation, just space. A pause so she could breathe without the feeling of being watched, without the fear that kindness had turned her into gossip. When she finished, she folded it carefully. Her hands shook the way they did before an asthma bill arrived in the mail. 3 days passed. Nora stayed home. She took Eli to the park, watched him climb and slide and laugh, as if the world hadn't ever been cruel. She baked cookies, let the scent of vanilla fill the apartment like a small spell. She smiled for Eli, real smiles, not the ones she wore for customers. But underneath, her chest stayed tight. On the 4th day, there was a knock at the door. Nora's heart jumped. Her body prepared itself for bad news the way it always did. She opened it to find Julian standing in the hallway. No suit, no polished smile, just quiet eyes, serious and steady. In his hand was a thick envelope. I heard you stepped. Oh, wait, he said softly, as if he didn't want to startle her. I figured maybe this would help you see what I see. Nora hesitated, then took the envelope. Her fingers moved slowly, cautious like she was handling something fragile. Inside was a typed letter, signed. A recommendation letter. At the top, bolded like a headline she didn't know how to wear. For the strongest person I've ever worked with. Nora's breath caught. She read the lines, how she showed up with kindness even when caring more than anyone should, how her strength didn't shout, how she lifted others without being asked. Then the words that made her vision blur. She is not here because of pity. She is here because the world needs more people like her. Her hands trembled so hard she had to grip the paper with both palms. She looked up at Julian, unable to speak. He stepped closer, voice gentle but firm. Nora, I never helped you because I felt sorry for you. He paused, letting it land. I helped because you deserve better, and I stayed because I wanted to. Nora's throat worked around a sob she didn't want to make. Not to save you, Julian added quietly, but to stand beside you. Something old inside Nora began to melt. An ugly belief she'd worn for years. That help always meant control. That kindness always came with strings you couldn't see until you were tangled. She pressed the letter to her chest. In the space of her silence, a softer truth took shape. Not everyone wants to own you. Some people just want you to be okay. Nora stepped forward and hugged him. Tight, quiet, real. Julian's arms wrapped around her with care, not possession, not urgency, just presence. And for the first time, Nora let herself believe that receiving wasn't weakness. Sometimes it was simply letting love be respectful. Christmas Eve arrived 1 year later like a soft echo. Familiar but changed. Harbor Spoon Cafe glowed from the street. Strings of warm golden lights curled around the windows. Snow dusted the sidewalk in a thin layer, and inside the air carried cinnamon rolls, fresh coffee, and something else. Belonging. The cafe was full, but not in the frantic way. This was a different kind of crowd. Co-workers who'd become friends, regulars who'd become family, strangers who'd once come in only for warmth, now staying because they felt welcome. At the center of the room stood a small, upright piano, polished as best as a modest cafe could manage. Someone had pinned paper snowflakes along the edge like a child's quiet masterpiece. Eli was 5 now. His legs dangled above the floor as he sat at the bench, a paper snowflake pinned to his sweater. His fingers hovered over the keys, trembling with the seriousness of someone about to say something important. Nora stood off to the side in a simple white dress that made her look like herself again, like the version of her that had existed before fear tried to shrink her. Her hair fell over her shoulders, soft and unguarded. She smiled at Eli, giving him the kind of look that said, "Whatever happens, I'm already proud of you." Eli took a deep breath and began to play. The melody was gentle, a little uneven, but full of heart, notes chosen carefully, as if each one had to mean something. The whole cafe went quiet. Even the kitchen seemed to pause, plates held midair, voices fading. Nora's eyes stung as she listened. Eli reached the final note and held it for a second longer than necessary, like he didn't want to let the moment go. Then applause broke out, warm and loud, wrapping around him like a blanket. Julian stepped forward from near the counter. He crouched beside Eli, smiling with a kind of pride that wasn't about ownership, it was about witness. "Hey, bud, Julian whispered, holding out a small velvet box. "Can you be my helper for a big surprise?" Eli's eyes went wide. He nodded, clutching the box like it was sacred. Julian stood and walked toward Nora. Nora's smile stayed, but confusion flickered across her face. Julian didn't kneel. He didn't make a speech. He didn't turn it into a performance. He simply took her hand, steady, warm, sure, and said softly, "Can I stay?" Nora blinked, caught somewhere between laughter and tears. "Not as your boss," Julian added, his voice low enough that the whole room didn't need to hear it. "As your family." For a second, Nora couldn't breathe. Not from panic this time, from the weight of what was being offered. Not rescue, not a spotlight, but a commitment that sounded like home. Before Nora could answer, Eli popped up like a tiny lightning bolt and shouted, "Only if you bring hot cocoa every night." The cafe erupted in laughter. Julian chuckled, eyes never leaving Nora's. His expression said everything he wasn't putting into words. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. I choose you." Nora laughed through tears she didn't bother hiding this time. She squeezed Julian's hand once, twice, like she was anchoring herself to something real. Outside, snow began falling again, soft and steady, covering the city in a clean white layer. Later, when the crowd thinned and the lights glowed lower, Nora, Julian, and Eli stepped out into the quiet evening. Julian slipped off his coat and draped it around both Nora and Eli, pulling them close as they walked. They didn't need matching last names. They didn't need perfect plans, because family, Nora had learned, isn't always made by blood. Sometimes it's made by choice, by showing up, by staying kind, by holding steady through winters. And on that Christmas, under the snowfall and city lights, they chose each other. After Christmas Eve, life didn't become perfect. It became steadier. That was the difference. Nora stopped measuring her days by emergencies. There were still bills, still long shifts, still mornings where Eli woke up coughing, and she had to sit beside him with the inhaler and her hand on his back until his breathing smoothed out again. But the panic no longer owned the whole house. Julian didn't move in like a conqueror claiming space. He didn't turn their lives into a project. If anything, he moved carefully, as if he understood that love, for someone like Nora, had to arrive quietly or it would feel like a threat. He showed up in small ways first. He fixed the loose cabinet hinge in the kitchen without making a big deal of it. He brought groceries once and let Nora pay him back over time without keeping score. He learned which brand of honey Eli liked in his tea and bought it without being asked. And when Nora worked late, he'd swing by the preschool to pick Eli up, carrying him home on his shoulders while Eli narrated the world like a tiny news reporter. To Nora, the most surprising thing wasn't Julian's help. It was his patience. Sometimes she would catch herself waiting for the hidden cost, waiting for the moment kindness turned into expectation. When you've lived a long time in survival mode, you learn to flinch before the hit even comes. One night after Eli had fallen asleep, Nora sat on the couch with a folded dish towel in her hands, twisting it slowly. Julian was at the small kitchen table reviewing paperwork, glasses on, brow furrowed. Nora cleared her throat. "I don't want people to think..." She stopped, embarrassed by how small the sentence sounded. Julian looked up. "Think what?" "That I'm here because of you, she said, now voice high, "that I'm only stable because you decided to..." Her words tangled. "I don't want to be someone's charity story." Julian set the papers down. He didn't rush to soothe her. He didn't interrupt. He just listened until she finished. Then he said, "You were surviving before I seeped in. I didn't create your strength. I just noticed it." His voice softened, "And I decided to add support where the world should have already offered it." Nora stared at him, the towel still twisting between her fingers. Julian continued, calm and precise. You don't owe me your pride. I'm not trying to buy your peace. That sentence, buy your peace, hit Nora in a place she hadn't known was still tender. She blinked hard. Then why do you stay? Julian's gaze didn't waver. Because I want to, and because being around you makes me better. He paused, then added, not in a dramatic way, in a real one. Nora's breath shook on the way out. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The apartment hummed quietly. Hold on. Well, now, Lily. Heater, distant traffic, the soft rhythm of a safe night. Then Nora leaned forward and rested her head against Julian's shoulder. He didn't hold her too tight. He just held her like she was allowed. A few days later, Harbor Spoon hosted a small community night, Nora's idea born out of her second dinner tradition. A pot of stew, baskets of bread, hot cocoa for kids, free refills for anyone who looked like they hadn't been warm in a while. Julian tried to stay in the background. He always did. But people noticed anyway, how he carried chairs, how he rinsed dishes, how he spoke gently to the teenager sweeping up crumbs as if the kid mattered as much as any investor. And still, the whispers came sometimes. Not from everyone, just from the corners. The old habit of people needing a story to explain what they don't understand. But this time, the whispers didn't land the same way. Because Nora had started to believe what Julian wrote in that letter. She wasn't dependent. She wasn't fragile. She wasn't here because of pity. She was here because she worked, because she showed up, because she loved her child fiercely, and because she had finally allowed someone to stand beside her. That night, as Nora was locking up the cafe, Eli ran outside first, little boots kicking up snow dust. He looked back at Julian with complete seriousness and asked, "Do you still work for Santa?" Julian knelt down, pretending to check both directions like spies do. "Always," he whispered. Eli nodded once, satisfied, then turned to Nora. "Mommy's home," he said, voice small in the cold. "I think Santa found us for real." Nora's eyes stung. She crouched, pulled him into her arms, and kissed the top of his head. "I think you're right," she whispered. And for the first time, she meant it without fear of being wrong. The night the snow came down thick again, Nora stood at their apartment window and watched it fall the way she had a year ago, only now her chest didn't feel like it was caving in. Eli was asleep in his room, sprawled diagonally across the bed like he owned the whole world. The stuffed bear was still there, patched once at the seam, still loved into softness. Julian was in the kitchen, rinsing dishes from Nora's late dinner. Quiet motions, familiar now. The kind of domestic sound that used to feel like a fantasy. Nora thought about the version of herself from last Christmas. Cold hands, a backpack, an eviction notice like a stamp on her forehead. She remembered Eli's question, "Will Santa still find us?" And how she'd lied beautifully because children deserved hope, even when adults didn't know where to find it. She hadn't realized then that the miracle wouldn't be a sleigh in the sky. It would be a series of small choices. A man stopping on a quiet street instead of walking past. A cup of cocoa. A warm room with 2 twin beds. A key taped to a note that said, "Just time." And then, most importantly, Nora choosing to accept help without letting it erase her. That was the part no one tells you. Receiving can be its own bravery. Later that week, Harbor Spoon hosted another Christmas Eve gathering. Smaller than the year before, but just as warm. The piano sat in the same spot, the lights curled around the windows. The cafe smelled like cinnamon rolls and coffee and soup. Eli, now confident, now taller in the way 5-year-olds suddenly become, played again. Not perfectly, but with a kind of heart that made grown adults blink fast and look down at their hands. When he finished, Nora hugged him tight, laughing into his hair. Julian stood beside them, one hand resting lightly at the small of Nora's back. Not claiming, just steadying. As the night wound down, the cafe emptied into soft goodbyes. Nora locked the door and turned the sign to closed. Outside, snow fell in quiet sheets, frosting the streetlights. Eli stepped between Nora and Julian and reached up to grab both their hands like it was the most natural thing in the world. They walked home slowly. Halfway down the block, Eli looked up at Julian and said, "You know, you don't have to be Santa's helper forever." Julian smiled. "Oh yeah?" Eli nodded gravely. "You can just be ours." Nora's throat tightened. She squeezed Eli's hand, then Julian's. Julian stopped walking for a moment and looked at Nora, snow gathering on his hair. "Can I still stay?" he asked softly. Not as a proposal this time, not as a big moment, just as a continued choice. Nora breathed in, feeling the cold air fill her lungs without pain. "Yes," she said. It was a simple word, but it carried a year's worth of survival, healing, and softness returning. Julian exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for a long time. He leaned in and pressed a gentle kiss to Nora's forehead. Slow, careful, like he was honoring the life she'd fought for. Eli made a dramatic gagging sound. Eli, Nora scolded, but she was smiling too hard for it to land. Mommy, Eli said, tugging her sleeve. Can we have hot cocoa at home every night? Julian chuckled. Deal. They continued walking under the snow and city lights, their steps leaving 3 sets of prints side by side, proof that the world could change shape without warning, that the hardest nights didn't always win. And somewhere in the quiet of that Christmas, Nora understood something she wished she could tell every version of herself that ever felt alone. Family isn't always who you're born to. Sometimes it's who you choose. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, it's also who chooses you back.